Hello, and welcome to episode 182 of Dark and Stormy Book Club. We are taking a few well-needed weeks off, and during this time we are going to rebroadcast several of our favorite episodes. This week we will visit with Bonnie MacBird. Enjoy.
I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome. If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the 104th episode of It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club. We have a long episode, but it's one that I'm sure you're going to enjoy. We talk with Bonnie MacBird, who writes the wonderful take on Sherlock Holmes called The Devil's Due. It is number 3 in her Sherlock Holmes series.
Before we get started with the interview, make sure that you stay tuned to the end. Bonnie was on video with us, so she was showing us some of her treasures she has in her home in London. It is definitely worth listening all the way to the very end. Enjoy!
Bonnie is an American writer, actress, playwright, screenwriter, and producer. She is the original writer of the science fiction film Tron. MacBird is a native of San Francisco and graduated from Stanford University with a bachelor's degree in music and a master's degree in film. She is married to computer scientist Alan Kay.
It's 1890 and the newly famous Sherlock Holmes faces his worst adversary to date, a diabolical villain bent on destroying some of London's most admired public figures in particularly gruesome ways. A further puzzle is that suicide closely attends each of the murders. As he tracks the killer through vast and seething London, Holmes finds himself battling both an envious Scotland Yard and a critical press as he follows a complex trail from performers to princes. But when his brother Mycroft disappears, apparently the victim of murder, even those loyal to Holmes begin to wonder how close to the flames he has traveled. Has Sherlock Holmes himself made a deal with the devil?
We would like to welcome Bonnie MacBird to our program, and she is the author of the Sherlock Holmes Devil's Due. Welcome, Bonnie.
Hi. You said you'd been a Sherlockian since you were about 10 years old, leading us to believe that you've been well versed in the canon. Were there any surprises for you as you researched in order to write your own Sherlock series?
Well, actually, yes. I read them at age 10, and then I reread them, throughout my life. But I reread them again while I was starting this series. Yes, I mean, when you read them all told, all at once, kind of as a continuous thing, certain things pop out to you that maybe don't when you read the stories individually or randomly. And one of those, of course, is really the artistry of this writer. He is just the most amazing adventure tale teller. Also, as an adult, looking back as an adult, I recognize the incredible craft of Conan Doyle. And as far as the character goes, yes, certain traits popped out. They're a little bit in each of the stories, but when you read the thing in total, you realize how, Holmes is actually what we would now call bipolar. And, he alternates this very manic energy with, complete, like laying on the couch doing nothing. And also, he might be what we would call Asperger's now. That is, he has this characteristic of sometimes being oblivious to the social norms. Sometimes it feels like a choice, but other times it feels like he just misses it. And then also that other Aspergerian trait, which is the ability to focus intensely, blocking everything else out. So, I mean, he's got some things that I now recognize as an adult that I, didn't see as a kid. And also, I think the value of the friendship between the two men means more and more to me as I get older.
That is the one thing that really came across in this book is, you always knew that Watson cared about Holmes. Just to see what he was willing to sacrifice for him in this book, I really appreciated that. And going back to what you said in the beginning about him being such a prolific and wonderful writer, is that I always considered his writing and somebody like Stephen King almost like a palate cleanser. Reading all these people, You read them and it was like, this is what good writing is.
Well, he has a style that when you're reading it, it feels effortless, but try to duplicate it and you realize the immense craft that this man had. Apparently, Conan Doyle grew up in a family where his mother was a gifted storyteller and she would tell him the stories as a kid. And then when he was in school, he would regale his schoolmates with stories, in the dorm at night or something. So, it looks effortless, but it's actually incredibly crafted. And the other reason we sometimes kind of what we call genre fiction, mystery and adventure and so forth, is sort of denigrated by, the literary world at times in favor of, lit fic, which is where nothing happens to no one you don't care about. Okay, I'm sniping here. But in other words, if genre fiction, which this is denigrated, I think sometimes we forget how incredibly crafted they are. And Conan Doyle did something pretty genius with the Sherlock Holmes stories in that he chose as his narrator a man of action, because Watson is an army doctor and he's kind of an adrenaline junkie. So he's a guy who doesn't wax poetic about things. He just sets the scene. Trees are blowing. It's this. It's lighter. It's boom. He's Victorian, so he uses beautiful language, but he doesn't linger on that stuff. He moves the story along. Watson is like Conan Doyle in that sense. Conan Doyle was a very physically active man, a sportsman, and an adventurer himself.
Well, you do a wonderful job of emulating Doyle's style and his vocabulary, but how do you still make the story your own?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't set out to make the story my own. I think some writers do. Some writers take Holmes and say, I'm going to write Holmes in science fiction. I'm going to write Holmes and Watson as women. They set out to put their own spin or their own take, put themselves basically into it. I didn't set out to do that. I wanted to write a book that I wanted to read, and I want more of Conan Doyle. So I would try to emulate. And then the other thing is, even though we try to be another person or emulate another writer, you cannot help but put some of yourself into anything you write. So one's point of view is just there under the surface and you can't really eradicate it. It's like a portrait painter. They're painting a portrait of someone else, but there's always something of them on the canvas, a little expression in the eyes. There's something of them that makes it to the canvas. So in other words, I'm not trying to put my stamp, but it has to be there because I'm me, and I'm not him. I'm not a Victorian gentleman. I'm a 20th and 21st century Californian. That being said, I try to weed out. I try to not let my modernity or my feminism, for example, overlay in any big way because it would take away from the story.
One thing that you created, or one person you created, was Hepzibah O'Malley. What was your inspiration for her?
Oh, that's a funny one. I heard that name Hepzibah when I was a kid, and I was always intrigued by it. It's such a weird name, Hepzibah. Do you know anyone named Hepzibah? But it's
I have an ancestor named Hepzibah.
Oh, okay. Oh, good. Yeah, but it's rare. It's a rare name. And so I looked it up, and it's a Hebrew name. So I decided that she would be Jewish. The most recent book, The Devil's Due, that was the third one in the trilogy so far. There's a fourth one coming. But in The Devil's Due, I did have as a kind of underlying theme the notion of prejudice and discrimination and fear of immigrants. It took place in 1890. If you look at London in 1890, there was a great deal of fear going through the population about immigrants, particularly the anarchists from Italy and France, but also there was a lot of fear and anger about Jewish people, about Irish people. Basically about anybody that isn't English born here. So, same old, right? None of this stuff really changes. But I thought, okay, I've got this girl, Hepzibah, but what if she was half Irish? And I immediately pictured her as having a Jewish school teacher mother, who was an intellect, and a very handsome, very skilled Irish boxer as a dad. And what kind of person would that be? And she might be super smart and super self-sufficient. She's orphaned young, but her hereditary gifts are from both sides. I thought that made a really interesting character and a lot of fun. So that's the genesis of Heffy. It turns out a lot of people have really liked that character. I didn't, set out, I am a feminist, but I don't set out to write feminist track. But nevertheless, interesting, strong female characters are appealing to me. So they're going to be in there. So she's constrained, as all women were in Victorian times, like many of the characters in my novels. She finds a way around, and many of them did at that time. My second book, Unquiet Spirits, took place in a whiskey family, a whiskey dynasty in the Highlands of Scotland. And I did quite a bit of research and tasted a lot of whiskey. Tough job, but somebody had to do it, right? But I did a lot of research. There was a famous distillery run by a man who died, and then his widow took it over and made it a huge success. So that really did happen in those times. So there were women who punched through the constraints of their time. But again, the Sherlock Holmes story is about Holmes and Watson. And so all these other people are peripheral, and I get interested in them, but try to see them through the eyes of Holmes and Watson. Holmes doesn't see class. He's a gentleman. He's probably an upper class person who probably was going to Oxford or Cambridge before he dropped out or was kicked out. And Watson is maybe just below upper class, but he's up there. So these two are gentlemen, but Holmes is not a snob. He will take clients from all walks of life and treat them equally badly sometimes. So I like that about Holmes and Watson's. That is sort of infused in the book as well.
When I read the book, my co-host disagrees with me, but we will discuss it with you.
Okay.
I take on the relationship between Mycroft and Sherlock. I took it that it was a bit different from when I read the original, that Sherlock was more bossy of Mycroft instead of Mycroft being the power behind the throne, so to say. What is your take on that?
Well, Mycroft only appears a couple of times in the originals. He's referred to more than that, but he only actually appears. In both cases, that's not really exactly what I've done in my books, and I'll differentiate that in a minute. But in both cases, Holmes is not bossing around his mother. I'm afraid your colleague is right about that. He doesn't boss around Mycroft, but there is kind of a little bit of a one-upsmanship between the two of them. Holmes also says to Watson that Mycroft is smarter than he is, but Mycroft is also incredibly lazy. So he doesn't get up out of his chair and go solve cases. He will sit in his chair and do things. But it's also mentioned that he kind of is the British government. So he's very powerful kind of behind the scenes. He's sort of a giant brain at work. And the two scenes that he is in canon, there's no threat from Mycroft, but there's a little bit of one-upsmanship, but kind of friendly way, friendly-ish, as brothers might be. From that, I thought it would be really fun. If Mycroft truly is smarter than Holmes, then he could take advantage of him in some ways. And he also is extremely powerful in the government, so he could maybe bail Holmes out of some trouble, which he does in one of my books. And he could also send him off on assignments and demand this and that. Now, in BBC Sherlock recently, they did make Mycroft be threatening to Holmes, to Sherlock. That's not in the originals. It was hinted at in a movie called The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, so other writers have done that. But I loved that. I thought that gave a tremendous amount of story juice, so to speak. And so I really liked that. I certainly didn't set out to copy or be inspired by BBC Sherlock. That one element really did appeal to me very much. I decided that it would be very interesting if you weren't quite sure whether Mycroft had Holmes's best interests at heart, and also give him kind of a formidable somebody to bounce off on, somebody who's as smart as he is or smarter. Now, Moriarty is supposed to be as smart or smarter also. He's not in my books. He's around the periphery. You may smell him at the edges. He doesn't feature in any of the 4 books so far. It's fun. It's fun to have Mycroft be a little scary.
Well, you did a good job with the villain in this book.
Oh, thank you.
Not Moriarty, but it was very well done.
I think it's a typical goal in a mystery adventure story is to have the villain be somewhat of a surprise. But then when you arrive there, you go, oh, it's not a rabbit out of the hat. I could have, oh yes, these clues and these and so forth, but yet still a surprise. That's the balancing act, kind of hard to pull off. So that's what I'm aiming for anyway. It's part of the promise, I think, of the books. I feel like there are a lot of promises promises connected to a Sherlock Holmes novel. Very few people come to a Holmes book without a fair amount of baggage, Holmes baggage. They've either read and inhaled the originals, or they're all BBC all the time, or they're only Jeremy Brad, or they're this, that, and the other. And people come bringing these very specific images, because Holmes he's the first superhero, really, in fiction. And he's also arguably the most popular fictional character of all time, because he's known in every country of the world, even in the remotest little places that don't have a lot of contact with the outside. Everybody knows Sherlock Holmes. So people bring their expectations